What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over blocking and block shields part 3. So specifically in this episode, we're going to go over actually visualizing the block shield, so adding a component that will work as our block shield, and we will be setting its visibility or hiding it when we need to, as well as changing the scale of it when we need to. So once we're in the game here, I can go over to one of my characters. So I will be playing as Shawnthebro and the yellow default, the two characters that are moving on the left hand side here. Now if I am to block, right now I have a huge block shield, but this is just for dramatic effect. Of course yours does not have to be nearly this large. Now whenever the player takes damage while they're blocking, we had a durability set up, and that durability would decrease until eventually it became 0 or somehow less than that. And once that occurred, the block shield would break and they would become stunned. So let's see this in action. As I attack my blocking opponent, the block shield gets smaller. Eventually, their block shield breaks and they become stunned, and they can't move until that animation is complete, or really until the stun timer is complete. Now once they are done, they are able to go back into blocking and start again. Now the block shield will remain the same size as it was left off as, so if I stop blocking and I go blocking again, it will remain the same size. Now technically we will want our block shield to regen over time. We don't have that logic set up yet, but of course we will be adding it. And all of our characters can use their different block shields. Additionally, as a nice little note, I've also added crouch blocking, which just occurs if we go into the blocking state while we're crouching. The same rules apply to that, so we can attack it to then stun the character in the crouch state. If you guys would like to get caught up in the series before we watch this episode, feel free to click on this iCard right here in the top right corner. That will show you exactly how you can do everything that we've implemented in the series so far, including weapons and items, attacks, animations, our HUD, and everything like that. Alternatively, if you're just interested in the blocking mechanics, feel free to click on this iCard in the top right corner right here, and it will bring you to part 1 of blocking within the Super Smash Brothers and Platform Fighter tutorial series. Anyway guys, with that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. To begin today, we're going to go into the code, and specifically we're going to go into our SSB template character.h. In here, we already have two components that have been initialized, which are the side view camera and the camera boom. These came from the side scroller template and I did not add them. However, since the components were here, I went ahead and added another component below them to represent the block shield component. I copied their U property settings, so you can do the same thing I've done here, which is to make it a U property that's visible anywhere, blueprint read only, with a category of this should be block, and meta of allowing private access to be true. These are the standard U property tags for a component that we're adding through the code, so I've just kept them. We don't have to change any of them right now. I'd recommend just leaving this alone for the time being. Now we want to add a static mesh component because our block shield is actually just going to be a mesh that goes over top of our character. It will turn with us when we turn, and we can scale it and hide it and make it visible and all that good stuff. But at the end of the day, it is just a static mesh that is basically in front of our character or over top of our character. If we do class useStaticMeshComponent pointer, block shield component, or whatever you want to call it, this is the actual variable that represents our component, and so we can use it to change things about our block shield component in the code. So even if we set it up and position it on the blueprint, we still can have full control over it in the code if we decide to. Once you've made this variable, you can go into your SSB template character.cpp, and we're going to go into our constructor. We can do a lot of things with our components in the constructor. This is a great place to set up all your default values. For me, I'm going to keep it really simple because I don't have a bunch of specific values that I want to use right now, but feel free to play around with this to your heart's content. Essentially, we want to create the default subobject and attach it to our root component. And what that means is we want to create this static mesh component, call it block shield, and attach it to our capsule component on our character. To do this, we can set our block shield component equal to create default subobject, This is a function that Unreal has for us to create this actual object. Then you give it the type. We want it to be a uStatic mesh component. Our block shield component is a uStatic mesh component pointer because we're pointing at this object. We're referencing it in memory. But the actual type that we are creating is just a uStatic mesh component, not a pointer. Then you have to give it a name. So I just give it text, the text macro, block shield. Now we're not at this point just yet, but if you go into your base character BP, you'll see components in here, such as your capsule component, your floating player name ref if you've been following this series, as well as some camera elements. The block shield component will show up here. This is the actual name of the variable that we're creating, and this is the text that shows up within this text macro. After you've done this, it will actually already be created in Unreal the next time you compile or load into the engine. But we want to make sure that we set it up as an attachment of the root component. That way it is below the root component. So our root component is our capsule component. If you hover over it, as it says here, this is the default scene root component. So this is the root. The root already exists just by typing in root component. You'll see I didn't have to define it anywhere or anything. This will just go to the highest parent element in the list. And technically you have self here, but self is not a component, it's the class. So the root component is always going to be the uppermost component in this list. So if we do block shield component, set up attachment, and put in the root component, this means it will become a child of the capsule collider. And that's what we want because we want it to follow us around. It should move when we move and rotate when we rotate. Now once you set this up, we're actually good to go into the blueprint. We will need to come back to the code later in the episode, but we can go into our editor. So launch your game or compile, however you're running this, and go into your base character BP. This block shield component should now be here. Make sure everything looks good with it. You won't see anything visually on here, but it should be within this list. Now I've hidden it currently, but I'm going to make it visible for you because I want to have this block shield looking like this. By default, even though this block shield component is a uStatic mesh component, it will not have a mesh or any materials on it. So click on the block shield component, go to the static mesh section here, and select the mesh that you want. For me, I'm using the basic shape sphere because I want it to be circular like the block shield that we see in Smash Brothers, but you can make it any shape, any mesh that you want. If you have your own custom mesh that you made, great, that'll fit here no problem. Then for the materials, you can give it a material if you had one. I decided to use my strike hitbox, but you can make another material very simply like we did earlier in the series, or you can use one that already exists in the standard Unreal starter content. Once you do that, then you will have an object with a material on it that represents your block shield component. You can change the scale like I have to make it smaller or bigger. It really doesn't matter too much because we are going to be changing it in the code. For mine, I just moved it down 60 units and then also changed the scale of the X and the Z to be 0.6 of the original. The Y, which is the depth, is just 1. It can remain the same. Now, as we scroll down here, we have a lot of different options we can have. For the collision presets, I did not actually do this, but I would recommend that you turn off collision on it and just make it no collision. If you want the durability of the block shield to go down only when the specific shield is hit, not the character while they're blocking, but the shield is hit, you will want to make sure you keep some form of collision on this, such as overlap all, and then that collision can be checked against other attacks, such as hitboxes or thrown items, to then decrease the durability of the block shield. For our case, I'm actually just blocking. If we're in the block state, the character is going to just block the attack and the durability of the block shield would decrease. So I don't want the actual block shield to have any collision on it. So I've set my collision presets to be no collision. For the visibility, I'd recommend setting it to false so that it is invisible, although you could also do this in the code. Just set it to false in the constructor. That is up to you how you want to handle that. Doesn't really matter. Both ways will get you the same result. Now, since you did this on your base character, any child class or any children will also inherit this block shield. So I have my mannequin BP and my second mannequin. Both of them are going to have this block shield component. And not only that, but the block shield component will have maintained all of its values, its location, scale, mesh, materials, collision settings, everything else. So you can make it visible in here and it will show up on the character all the same. You can see it's actually a little bit lower than where I should have placed it. When I have a model in here, it's easier. In just the base, it's a little bit harder. So I'll go ahead and move it up a little bit. Let's move it to -30, for example. And that's all well and good. You can actually change it for every character. So if you change it in a child class, if you want it to be different where this character has their block shield, that's perfectly fine. It won't affect the base. But if you change it on the base, it will affect all children. You don't actually have to do anything in here. Just make sure that you know that the block shield component is now on all your children. So it'll be on my other child class as well. I'm going to save them just to make sure they get all those changes. And here we are. So we have our block shield component on our base character BP. Subsequently, all characters below that. At this point, you would be able to go into your game, and assuming your block shield wasn't invisible, you'd be able to see it. However, we still have a lot of different logic we want to do with it, depending on what's going on in the game. So let's get to that logic as well. The first place we want to go to is our start blocking and stop blocking functions. So if I scroll down to start blocking, before in the series, we were checking to see if we weren't in any of these specific states we wanted to skip, basically the states that we can't go into our block state from. And if we weren't in any of them, we set the character to be the blocking state, and that was it. Now in this function, we're going to do two additional things, which are going to set the visibility of the block shield and change the size of the block shield to be representative of the durability. Again, in my case, I have made it quite large. It is not required that you do that. I just did a simple function for this now because I wanted to make sure we could have it clear what was going on. To change the scale of the block shield component, it's actually very simple. We can just grab our block shield component, call set relative scale 3D, and we have to pass it an F vector. So make a new F vector, parenthesis, and then you have to give it an X, Y, and Z to fill out that F vector. Well, we can use our block shield durability on the X plus 1.0. The Y is the depth, so again, it doesn't really matter. That doesn't need to change since we're not in a 3D world where they can move toward the camera or farther away from the camera. And then on the Z, I'm adding block shield durability plus 1.0F. The reason I'm doing the plus 1.0F is just because if the block shield durability reaches 0, we can still visualize it as very small. But if you don't want to do that, you can simply just leave the relative scale 3D as block shield durability. It will be perfectly fine to do this, and it will still work. Just when the block shield goes to break, you won't be able to see it anymore. So if you do play the visual effect on it, on the mesh of the block shield, then you actually wouldn't be able to see the effect either because it would be too small. It would be a scale of 0. However, we can actually just play the effect based on the hitbox or on the character themselves, so it's also safe to do this method. Either way is fine. I think I'm actually going to leave it like this and play the effect on the character because I do believe that is a little bit simpler to understand. Then we want to make sure that the block shield becomes visible. We are starting the block. So now we have the size right for the block shield, but we want to make sure that we can actually see it as well. So we can grab our block shield component, call set visibility true on it to make it visible. Now in the stop blocking function right below it, we were checking to see if the character was blocking, and if they were, bring them back to idle. Additionally to this, we want to make sure that we set the visibility of the block shield component to be invisible, because at this point the character is no longer blocking, so we shouldn't be able to see the shield. And to do that, we can simply do the opposite of what we did to show it. We can call block shield component set visibility, but pass it false instead. We can now scroll down to our take damage function. For me, that is right below it. And we had this logic that was occurring if we weren't blocking. That's all staying the same today. We're only worried about the else statement, which of course is if the character was blocking. Up to this point in the series, we were decreasing the block shield durability when a hit occurred and the character was blocking, and if the block shield durability was less than or equal to 0, we broke the block shield. I've added an else statement to that if, meaning that the block shield durability is greater than 0, and if that's the case, it's still visible, so we want to change the scale of the block shield durability on each hit. As the comment says, we are updating the scale of the block shield to be representative of the remaining durability. So we can do the same thing that we did in start blocking, which was to grab the block shield component, call set relative scale 3D, make a new F vector, and pass it our X, Y, and Z. Since I took out the +1 on the X and Z within the start blocking function, I'm also going to do it here. Just make sure that this relative scale matches the relative scale that you set up in start blocking, as we don't want to mismatch. That would be a little bit weird, and it could be harder to read how much durability the shield has remaining. Lastly, let's go down to our break block shield function that we set up in our previous blocking episodes. So in break block shield, we were setting the character state to be stunned, and we were setting the stun frames equal to the block shield break stun frames. Now, we're also going to hide the block shield in this case. We want to make sure that we are setting the visibility to false. So block shield component, set visibility, false. That's all the code out of the way. Let's make sure we can have our animations for crouch block and stunned in here as well. So I'm going to go into my default AnimBP. No changes to the actual event graph are necessary today. I just added 2 new states, a crouch block state and a shield break stun state. As always, add a state by right-clicking in the graph and pressing add state, then typing in the name of the state. Let's start with the crouch block state. Only from start crouch can we go into crouch block. So start crouch is this animation. I don't have a crouch loop currently in the game. So this is actually the idle down to the crouch. And so that can go into the crouch block state, which is just this. It's basically just the character holding out their arm like they're holding a shield. So in my crouch block, I am using that animation. To go from start crouch to crouch block is very simple. We do the same logic as if we were going from idle to blocking. We grab our character reference, which is the owner of this AnimBP, grab their character state, and check if it's equal to blocking. If it is, we can go from start crouch to crouch block. The reverse is also the same. If we want to go from crouch block to start crouch, all that needs to happen is the character does not need to be blocking anymore. If they're not blocking, we can assume that we can go to start crouch. So grab our character reference, grab the character state, and then we check not equal enum, and we don't want to be equal to blocking. Now, additionally, since we do have the stun state now, and we actually have an animation for it for the idle, we should check if the character state is not equal to blocking and not equal to stunned. Because if it is not equal to blocking, but it is equal to stunned, we want to play a different animation than just returning to start crouch. So really, this would be the optimal transition rule from crouch block to start crouch. Now, as far as the blocking goes, this was our standing block. This is what we had. And I've added a new state here called shield break stun, which is playing this animation. And it's actually a character having some back pain, but this is the stun animation I am using. To go from blocking to shield break stun, it's very simple. We just check our character state of stunned. So I have character reference, character state, equal enum, and we're using our stunned enum that we set up in the previous episode. That will allow us to go from blocking to shield break stun. As an added safeguard, we should make the same change that we made from blocking to idle that we did crouch block to start crouch. So if you look at your blocking to idle transition rule, it was just checking to see if the character state was not equal to blocking. We should also check and make sure that the blocking to idle transition rule checks to make sure that character state is not equal to stunned. As you saw earlier in this episode, it actually worked no problem. The character did not go from blocking to idle. They did, in fact, go into their stun state. But it is better to check for it when possible. Or, additionally, you could use the priority order to make sure that if two conditions become true at the same time, one is taken over the other. And that would be our shield break stun. Either method is fine there. And lastly, our shield break stun back to idle is actually going to be an automatic rule. It has no rule in here. We are just going to click the transition rule and select automatic rule based on sequence player and state. Essentially, once the animation is finished playing, return to idle. Additionally, you could make another state here, such as crouch, shield, break, stun. And this would be able to return to start crouch as well. Crouch, shield, break, stun, back to start crouch would be automatic, just like shield, break, stun to idle was automatic. But crouch block to shield, break, stun would actually be character reference, character state, equal enum, stunned. And so if the character was in the crouch block, but then they entered the stun state, they would then enter the crouch, shield, break, stun animation. I have this animation here, which is crouch stunned. I've just added. We can go ahead and trim this guy down and use him. So it's actually a wall peek animation, but it will work. Just using it as a placeholder. You can put, of course, whatever you want in here. So I'm going to trim it to the spot that I want. Right click. And remove. And now I have my new animation, which is just that silly little animation, but that will work. We're going to put that inside the state so we can test it. Connect that. We can play, and I'll skip ahead a little bit here. And now we are able to see while I'm crouching, my block shield works the same. And once it is broken, I go into that new animation. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the series than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give another shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters. Thank you guys for everything you do. Really, really appreciate it and really grateful for you guys. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I would be happy to assist and get you all fixed up for the next episode. Anyway, guys, that's all I got. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.